Welcome. My name is Jeffrey Weidlinger, and I'm the director of the new Raoul Wallenberg Institute. This institute is named in honor of Raoul Wallenberg, a Michigan graduate from the class of 1935 who led the most successful rescue operation of Jews during the Holocaust and saved the lives of thousands of Hungarian Jews by issuing protective passports and sheltering families from deportation in safe houses throughout Budapest. The Institute, established less than 6 months ago, will study hatred directed against religious and ethnic communities, foster cross-cultural understanding, and elevate civic discourse through teaching, research, and public engagement by developing strategies to combat anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination. As part of this mission, we are sponsoring this conversation series with the goal of engaging students and the public with discussions about timely topics dealing with ethnic and religious hatred and tolerance. These moderated conversations invite scholars and practitioners to share their expertise with the campus community, to showcase diverse opinions, and to model open and respectful dialogue. Today's conversation takes place during a difficult period in our own nation's history, as well as in the state of Israel and among the Palestinian people. Yesterday marked 500 days since the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023 ignited the current fighting between Israel and Gaza. Fighting that has unleashed unimaginable suffering for both Israelis and Palestinians and anguish for all those around the world. It is upsetting to look back over the last 500 days and equally difficult right now to imagine a brighter future. Here at Michigan, we are united in pain and, I think, a feeling of helplessness. It is not only a pain of empathy for those directly impacted, but also, at least I personally, feel a sadness over our collective inability to talk constructively with each other, to express sympathy for each other, to comfort each other, and to be comforted by each other. I hope that today's conversation can be a first step toward at least seeking understanding of each other and trying to listen. I want to say from the start that this conversation is not about bringing peace to the Middle East or even about offering solutions to the current conflict in Israel and Palestine, nor is it to litigate past injustices. You won't hear any of the panelists presenting the Israeli perspective or the Palestinian perspective or any other group's perspective. I've asked each of them to speak only for themselves, to speak from the deep expertise that they bring to the topic and from the richness of their own experiences. I recognize that there may be many of you in the audience who have differing perspectives, who have experiences that seem to contradict what you'll be hearing from the stage. Many of you may have emotional reactions or rational disagreements with what we say. I'm grateful that we live in a pluralistic society and are at a university that encourages us to draw our own conclusions from the evidence that we share. I'll take this opportunity, therefore, to remind you all that the university's deep commitment to freedom of expression does not extend to the right to substantially disrupt or interfere with the speech of others. You should all have index cards available, or if you don't, Miriam Mora over here, our managing director at the Wallenberg Institute, who I will also thank, by the way, along with Joe Johnson for helping put together this event, has index cards, and you should have pencils with them. And as we are talking, we'll begin with about a half hour of conversation among ourselves, and then we'll take questions on index cards from the audience. You can just signal to her after about a half an hour, she'll go around and collect them. You can signal to her if you need an index card or if you have a card with a question on it that you want to give her. She's also got golf pencils. We come prepared. We'll use that to guide the last segment of our discussion. That being said, we have with us today 3 scholars with highly informed opinions based on both expertise and experience. So let me introduce them to you. And maybe I'll ask them to come to the stage now, our 3 panelists, and to take seats over there. And as I'll introduce them all together, and then I will take a seat over here and begin our conversation. So Carla Goldman, to my right, is the Saul Drackler Professor of Social Work and Director of the Jewish Communal Leadership Program here at the University of Michigan. She is the author of Beyond the Synagogue Gallery, Finding a Place for Women in American Judaism, and is currently working on a history of Jewish community life in America. To her right is Mostafa Hussein, an assistant professor of Judaic Studies here at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. His work focuses on Muslim-Jewish relations in Ottoman and Mandate Palestine and the history of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. He is the author of Arabo-Islamic Culture and Zionism in Palestine, 1882 to 1948, which is forthcoming with Princeton University Press, and which I've had the pleasure of reading, and is really a fantastic work. And Mostafa, by the way, also sits on the executive committee of the Wallenberg Institute. Aaron Rock Singer, to Mostafa's right, is a research fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and a lecturer in Judaic and Middle East studies. His work focuses on the relationship between religion and politics in the Middle East, and he is the author of Practicing Islam in Egypt, Print Media and the Islamic Revival, and In the Shade of the Sunnah Salafi Piety in the 20th Century Middle East. So I'll move over here now, and I see my microphone is still working. And I'll begin by asking each of our speakers to really reflect on what the last 500 days has been like for them professionally and personally. And I know, Carla, I'll start with you. I know that you have been doing a lot of work through the Jewish Communal Leadership Program in the School of Social Work, where I imagine there is a diversity of opinions that has been expressed. And maybe I'll ask you how you've been dealing with that and how you've been managing.
Jeff. So, looking back 500 days and thinking about sort of what I've been involved in since then and what I've been trying to accomplish, certainly the first thing was thinking about what it meant to support my students. So students in the Jewish Communal Leadership Program. Last fall, I was also teaching a survey course in American Jewish history. And suddenly, everyone was dealing with sort of the emotional fallout and horrific things that had happened on October 7th and that followed. And I just thought a lot about what it meant for us to be in a university at that time. And so to the students in the undergraduate class who are being buffeted by very strong voices and opinions to try and say, somehow we have to figure out our way through this, right? If there are different narratives, if you're hearing different narratives, it means there are different narratives. It means there's not just one narrative. And what does that mean to us? And how do we make sense of that? And from within the perspective of the class I was teaching, how do we understand now the American Jewish community's response in the context of what we're learning? Right? And folks we kept talking about it, and in student evaluations, they said, oh, this isn't helping us prepare for the final exam. But in fact, it did help them prepare for the final exam, because that's what we're trying to understand. What does it mean to navigate being sort of a distinctive religious minority, ethnic minority in this society? Within the Jewish Communal Leadership Program in the School of Social Work, I felt like my first responsibility was really did it mean to support the students, right? They did feel very silenced. They did feel there was a very strong narrative that was present among students in the School of Social Work. They did feel the statement that was signed by many of their professors in the days very soon after October 7th was one that pitted them in a position, some of them against their professors. I decided very quickly I was never going to sign another statement again, although maybe I have since then, because just realizing, but I was just sort of thinking about, what does it mean to teach? What does it mean to be in the university? We have to teach all our students. We brought in, our agenda changed quite a bit, in part because the people who were going to be part of our program had emergency things to do. We brought in a lot of people who could hear the students. The students found ways to support each other. But also, this was not just that, obviously. It was very important that people feel like they could continue to have a voice, they could continue to share with each other and continue to learn. but also to challenge them, right? So the same thing is if you're holding tightly to a narrative that is very personal and existential to you, what does it mean to realize there are other narratives out there? So how do you interact sort of with the community beyond you? And as we've moved into this year, where I think there's been a lot less kind of noise around this in people's classes, probably too quiet about it in a way, because it still very much continues to be a factor, is to do some of this work. I appreciate this opportunity. You know, it's a challenging one to come here and think about this, but also to ask my students to do some of that work. That how do we get to those conversations you were talking about, Jeff, right? The ones in which we can talk to people who maybe don't share the same opinion with us, and we can listen to them and we can hear them. And within the School of Social Work, we've been able to do a number of things that did open up that possibility, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think that this year we spent a lot more time sort of reaching out to other communities and hearing from different perspectives and realizing that we can talk across those lines. I think that's what we'll be continuing to do as weeks and months advance.
Thanks. Yeah, certainly a school of social work should be the type of place that these conversations can happen.
And I will say, I do want to say it was quite, you know, there was a sense, and I know folks felt silenced in different ways on different sides last year. From different perspectives, but certainly, you know, there was sort of like this kind of, I'll say this, I talked to one of my advisees who has sort of no skin in the game, and she talked about sort of being in classes and sort of feeling like people were sort of hollowed out, and they were silenced in the midst of this. Certainly, I want to, you know, thank the DEI folks in the School of Social Work and the Dean for supporting us, for supporting efforts to really continue to work in reaching out amongst ourselves and with others.
Yeah, thanks. Now I want to return in later rounds to the subject of narratives and well as to the subject of silencing and what silencing means. I also want to mention, I should have mentioned during the introductions, I mentioned that Mustafa is a member of the Wallenberg Executive Committee. I should have mentioned that Carla also is, but I only thought of it as I was talking about Mustafa. Anyway, I'll turn to Mustafa now. I know that you've been doing a lot of community engagement over the last 500 days and even before that. And I have to imagine that that has been difficult and contentious for you as well. And yes, maybe I'll ask you if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I will answer to this question, Jeff, but I would like to pick up on something that Carla mentioned, that she mentioned narratives multiple times. Not just one narrative, narratives in the plural sense. And I've been teaching here at the University of Michigan a course on Palestine, Israel since 2019, and why in all subjects are you interested in this? My interest in Israel-Palestine goes back to the first Intifada, actually, after 1987, and what happened afterwards was the Oslo Agreement in 1993. And I still remember distinctively, vividly in my memory that the picture of Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands and looking for a better future for both people in the same land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordanian River. And that sparked my interest to, and actually sparked also my hopes and my aspirations to a possibility for both people to live together on the same land. And I thought that would not be plausible unless I master both narratives to be able to understand the Palestinian point of view and the Israeli perspective from early on. I developed this through my training into what I called relational history. Relational history is basically a methodological approach in which you look at the interactions between both people as they influence one another one way or another. Like you look at Israel-Palestine not just as mono-layered city, state or a landscape. It's a multi-layered landscape that is consisted of different narratives. And only through mastering these narratives will we be able to understand what Israel-Palestine is, what does it mean for Palestinians and Israelis. So I use this relational history, this approach in my course, and I challenge my students, and I'm also challenged every time I teach on a certain subject, like, for example, hummus. Everyone knows what hummus is, and is it an Israeli dish? Is it a Palestinian dish? Everyone has a perspective. Everyone has their own narrative and their own point of view. And this narrative is not superficial, is actually embedded in their religious, cultural, social, and historical background. So it gets a very, very interesting exercise to do. So that being said, dealing with people, or whether they are students or community members who approach the subject from only one point of view has been challenging for me and also for them. And I understand where are they coming from, and I appreciate their commitment to their narrative, but I challenge them, and I think this is the task we are doing here in academia, is to find what we know less about and to master by learning about it. That's what I've been doing in my, and after October 7th, I continued to hold on to this methodological approach. Is in order to understand what happened on October 7th, you have to understand what happened on October 6th, October 5th, October 4th, etc. through contextualization. Yeah, it was horrible what happened, but also we have to put things in perspective. We have to put things in historical context, which was very challenging for some people, for sure. I also received, which was unusual, as you know, if you are teaching a course here at the university, you became like a surgeon. If there is like an emergency, there is a heart operation or something, you just like very cool, calm, and collected, step in, do the job, and leave. And by the time you get acquainted, you get like accustomed to undertaking these operations, not having any feeling or any connection towards the subject matter. I remember a Palestinian student who was in my class a few years ago, and he said to me once, "Professor Hussain, why do you smile when you teach on this subject? Why do you have a smile on your face when you teach on, occupation, oppression, struggle, conflict between both people?" I said to him, well, and I also relate to something that Jeff said at the beginning, that we're not here to change the Middle East. We have not like a magical wand that we can change things, but at least we can help have a healthy perspective on the situation by being optimistic about what will happen and stimulate our political imagination that something good will happen sometime in the future. So holding on to that has been inspiring for me, and that's the spirit that I have been passing on to my students in my classes. Also, do I still have time?
Sure.
Yeah. I've begun receiving some calls from community members here from Ann Arbor, Bloomfield, and from Boston. We need your help. We want to learn more about this, what is happening in the Middle East. And they were actually hurt and they were anguished by what was going on and the impact of what was going on in Israel and Palestine on the communities here, like on Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and also in their relationship with their Jewish colleagues, Jewish neighbors. They were concerned about this, and they wanted to get the record right, to be able to talk about it with their neighbors, with their friends, with their colleagues in a good way. They don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, so they know this subject is historically, religiously, emotionally charged, and they want to know how to navigate this. So I received a call from an imam in Bloomfield, and as you know, Bloomfield has a substantial Jewish community over there. I'm not being envious or anything, just stating facts. So he said to me, "Professor Hussain, we are worried about our relationship with our neighbors. And we know there are some people in our community who have different perspectives. We want you to come and talk to us about this." And I didn't say no. I had a very interesting time. I was so busy, so overwhelmed, actually. But I committed myself not to say no, even if it was unpaid. I have to go and say something good, because that will last. That will stay longer than anything else, than labeling, than watching what is happening on social media, TikTok, etc., etc. So I went to Bloomfield, and the community was amazing. Just was great. I found like a hall was full of Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jews. People asked me wonderful questions, interesting questions. One of the questions was when Jesus will come. And I didn't have the answer to that question because I was talking about Christian Zionism, and he thought he knew the answer. He told me in 10 years, Jesus will come. It was great to learn something in exchange for teaching people things. But I just wanted to teach people about this like intertwined world between both people, and learn about this stuff by putting it in a historical context, not just to judge, not to be taken by the hour, by the moment, and pass on a hasty judgment on what is going on.
Let me turn to Aaron. We'll get back to a lot of the points that you raised that I think are really fascinating. And I also have seen you do this type of interaction over the years, and you and I have had many conversations about it that I have greatly valued and continue to value. Aaron, you also have been teaching courses on Israel, on the Middle East. Maybe if you can talk a little about your experiences doing that, or other aspects of how the last 500 days have impacted you.
So I think back to the morning of October 7th, and I specifically think back to the first two text messages I sent that morning. One was to an Israeli friend, the other was to a Palestinian friend. Both people that were and are very close to me. And to the Israeli friend, I said, I am so sorry what's happened. I don't know, I can't imagine what you're going through right now. To the Palestinian friend, I said, I fear for what will happen. And that's very much reflective of the relationships that I've built over really the last 30 years. Now, I spent 2 years in Jerusalem as a kid. Needless to say, that had a rather large impact on the direction my life went. But it means, and it has meant, that my social and academic worlds are very much filled with people who are not only deeply connected to Israel and Palestine, but also folks who don't have any necessary direct connection, but care about those topics and those places and the people within them that have suffered. And so since October 7th, there's been a lot of pain. And pain that people struggle to talk to each other in ways that they used to. Long-standing relationships between friends that I've seen fall apart. Now, one of the things I am most grateful for is that that hasn't happened to me. But that's not a coincidence, right? That's a product of the fact that I've had to have some tough conversations with people who couldn't stand to be in the same room as each other. So I've, from one side or the other, it has been a process of saying, okay, how do we talk here? How do we connect here? How do we sit in community when we disagree about deep issues? Now, sometimes you can't talk about those issues, right? My experience has been sometimes the best thing you can do is say to someone, listen, I know this time is hard. I care about you. Just to say something as simple as that. And after October 7th, I reached out to various friends. And I wasn't posting on Facebook. I don't post much more than Eagles highlights and pictures of my kids on Facebook. But I was messaging people privately and saying, hey, I'm thinking of you. This is a terrible time. And so frequently the message I got back was, thank you so much for reaching out. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know even who to say it to. And these aren't challenges that I face alone. Perhaps I faced them more acutely because of who my friends were, because of who my communities were. But these are challenges that we all face in some way or another. And these are challenges, to come to the second part of Jeff's question, these are challenges students face. Teaching in the classroom about Israel and Palestine, about the Middle East over the past year, one of the things that my students struggle with most is this question of how do I communicate with nuance and depth while not assuming that I agree with my peers about everything, right? How do I speak in a way that doesn't presume shared opinions that may not be shared. And related to this is a fear of speaking indelicately and being perceived to be immoral or worse, someone who should be ostracized socially, should be canceled. And so in many respects, one of the core skills that I've been working with students on over the past year is just how to talk to each other. And not just how to talk to each other, but really how to listen. How to have a conversation in which you don't just recite your opinion or present a talking point, but really listen to what other folks are saying. Consider, for a second, that they might have something to teach you, even if you are so sure of your opinion, even if especially if it is deeply tied to how you define yourself as a human being. And that's scary sometimes for students. Needless to say, it's scary for adults too. But I think it's one of the places where there has been the most growth that I've seen in my students. Their ability to engage with people and to engage with each other in ways that they really couldn't have before, and that they were quite frankly petrified to try. And for me, the classroom learning about these topics is not just about learning about the history. It's actually about modeling exactly what we're doing on this stage. It's about modeling how do we be in community in a way that allows us to disagree, that presumes good faith rather than bad faith, unless someone has shown such obvious bad faith that one can assume bad faith, right? There can be bad faith, but it's a high bar to establish bad faith. And I found that there rarely in those settings is bad faith, and there's an opportunity for students to learn a great deal.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll say that one of the principles that I try to use is to always give the other person the benefit of the doubt, and to assume that they're coming from their position for legitimate reasons, for reasons that are deeply personal to them. And I think that makes a difference, particularly in the case of Israel, Palestine, where there are really hard-held beliefs. I also want to say, while I've got the floor here, another aspect of the way that we are developing that I think is a little bit problematic is the notion that is reinforced, particularly to students over and over again, that they should stand up for what they believe in. And that is a very important skill, but college essays, college admission essays often ask you to write about a time that you stood up for something that you believe in. And that is important, but I think it's also good sometimes to hear the other perspective and to seek compromise. And that's a lesson I think we can do a lot better educating young people about, is that sometimes you don't need to dig in your heels, particularly when you're younger and still learning. Sometimes it's advantageous to hear the other person's perspective. So let me, on that note, which you've brought up a lot of those issues, let me turn specifically to the issue of Israel-Palestine and ask why that issue seems to be so divisive and so difficult for us to talk about here on the university campus or in general. And maybe I'll start with Mustafa this time, if that's okay.
So there are different ways to answer this question. Perhaps let's talk about it from a scholarly perspective. Like when you teach the history of Israel-Palestine, which, so first of all, everything is controversial when it comes to the history of Israel-Palestine. The word conflict that we chose the title for our panel today is disputed thing to talk about between both sides. So, and from a scholarly point of view, there are three major approaches to study the subject. One is to speak about it from a purely Palestinian point of view and consider the emergence of Zionism as a beginning of settler colonial movement that started in the late 19th century, that took roots in late Ottoman Palestine and proceeded through the present. Another perspective, that's the Israeli perspective, the national point of view, is to consider the Zionism as a purely nationalist movement that emerged in Europe as a response to anti-Semitism and also in response to the emergence of national nation-state projects models in Europe. So both, if I want to mention something, that when you think about this as in parallel narratives, the problem of these parallel narratives is that they don't ever meet. When we talk or study the history of Israel and Palestine from both perspectives, they are disintegrated from one another, and you get to know less, or get to know more about the national perspective of both sides, and less about the place itself and about the landscape itself and how both communities influence one another one way or another. And a third approach, which I mentioned earlier, that is look at the engagement, intertwinement between both narratives and how Zionists influenced the Palestinian national movement in a way, and the Palestinian national movement influenced also the advancement of Zionism in Palestine. That also very important to bear in mind. But those who are trying to use, it has a consequence in terms of BDS, boycott, and blacklisting. If someone is using let's say third way, this relational history kind of way of trying to find the national perspective or the national dimension of Zionism versus its settler colonial paradigm, they usually get blacklisted by both sides because it's a very difficult thing to for people, for even academics to grapple with, because it's far easier to station yourself in one camp and advocate for it rather than seeing the same issue from a different perspective. Like, for example, give you an example is 1948. Is it a moment of victory or is it a moment of defeat? From the Israeli point of view, it's a point of victory. It's it's a victorious war. The few against the many. For the Palestinian, is actually a sheer defeat moment, and it's the beginning of the Nakba, the catastrophe. But when we try to complicate this a little bit, and we use these actors as practicing their own agency, they did something to the other side during 1948, or to bring in the British into the mix and try to see how the British policy, for example, led both people to that situation, this moment of 1948 that started as a civil war and then later on expanded to be a full-fledged war between Israel and its neighboring Arab states. So that makes things complicating the narratives around certain historical moments in the history of Israel-Palestine can make people susceptible to boycott and blacklisting. I gave one example. Like during the last 2 years, I was working on an article, peer-reviewed article, and I contacted a very respected journal based in Britain. And if you know something, that Britain were the first started the boycott against Israeli scholars in 2003, in response to the Second Intifada or something. So I started the process. It takes 2 years to publish an article in a peer-reviewed journal. Everyone knows that. It's not like easy thing to do. I started the process before October 7th, I think maybe a year and a half before October 7th. And then I received a positive report from the editors, from the journal's editor, and then they suggested to do some revisions to publish it. I said, okay, fine, I'll do the revisions. They are minor revisions, and it will not take me much time to do that. By the time I submitted back the article, October 7th hit. And the journal people thought that they needed to prioritize other issues over this issue. My article was maybe lame, the perspective, because I was talking about a Jewish scholar engaged with the Quran in British Palestine or something. So to them, it was not a very pressing issue to talk about at this moment. They basically shelved the article. They put me on ice. They would not respond to my emails, whether the article be published at any point. And so I found myself I was blacklisted, or because I was maybe normalizing Zionism, not talking about Zionism in a harsh way as people may think it should be talked about. And it can be problematic to try to find both narratives when it comes to discuss Israel-Palestine. This is just one example of why it has been exceedingly difficult to talk about Israel-Palestine. Yeah.
Very good article. I think I read that article.
Thank
Isaac
you.
Yehuda.
Yeah, I managed to publish it somewhere else.
Yeah, it's a great article.
Some
So
people,
everything worked out fine.
yeah, it did. Yeah, some people say that there's a lot of fish in the sea.
Yeah. Carla, you want to take the question?
So I was thinking about this, and I think actually it's not that hard to talk about Israel-Palestine as long as you agree with the person you're talking to. Then it's very easy. Or if you don't agree with them, then if you just will listen, it's also very easy to hear about Israel-Palestine. And I've done that a lot. And we're going back to sort of narratives, and you know what? There are very compelling narratives on different sides of this issue. And so it's hard to argue with very deeply held, personal, really existential, right? Existential perspectives on this, because that's what is at stake. And, as was mentioned, before October 7th and after, but even more after October 7th, the narratives around how do we get to a different point in whatever we call this, right, have been extremely polarized. Like the people with the loudest voice have been at certain ends of a spectrum, even if most people are somewhat in the middle. But October 7th, I just think, put that on steroids, right? Because how do you defend what has happened from any perspective, right? If you're critical of, if you feel what happened on October 7th as a terrible human tragedy, how do you speak up for any perspective that seeks to erase that, or even to contextualize it, so it needs to be contextualized? But here is this sort of raw tragedy and massacre. From the other perspective, how do you defend what has happened to Gaza since October 7th, and sort of done by Israel? How can you defend that if, that's your people and that is your place and that is your understanding? And you can't defend it. You can't defend either side of this. And yet, I think I'm losing my sound here, but people do, right? People do still speak up for those perspectives, even though really what they're defending is a terrible thing. On either side, what's happened has been terrible. And so what do? And the leadership that we have to bring us out of this has actually been terrible, right? We don't have that on either side. And so how do you speak up for one side? So people are very dug in these perspectives, and will tell you, if you don't agree with them, that you're a genocidal murderer, or that you're a genocidal murderer, right, on both sides of this. So that's like not an acceptable place to be. And most of us don't want to be genocidal murderers. And so a lot of us are silenced in the midst of this. And as was discussed, and I was just discussing with my students, what gets lost, of course. I don't teach Israel-Palestine. You two do. So I do try and ask that we bring more nuance and sort of understanding and empathy to the space. But we're not necessarily learning the pieces that bring that together, but we do and can and should try to model what that means. But those are the things, obviously, that get sort of wiped out on the poles of this conversation. And it's just always been my feeling, this goes back to what are we doing here? What are we doing in a university? Those of you who are members are teachers and students, those of you who are community members, you come to the university for something, which is not necessarily to be given sort of a monochromatic narrative that doesn't take into account context and different points of view, but somehow we have one, as Mustafa was just saying, like, how can they be parallel and never meet, right? Because we're talking about the same thing, but we've achieved that. And so, well, we're going to be asked, what do we have the possibility of doing in a university? Often, it's where those sort of those narratives that refuse to acknowledge the other actually get advanced. But many of us come to a university and we're in a more diverse community than maybe where we came from or maybe where we're going. And this should be the place where we have the opportunity to have those conversations, right? To do that listening, to learn from people with different perspectives, but also who have the nuanced perspectives, right? And it's just very interesting, of course, that we, as Jeff was saying, you speak up for your cause maybe doesn't, which I believe one should, but it doesn't always allow space for the empathy that we need, right? To realize that staying at those poles, if we stay there, and if we allow those to be the voices in the room, not just the loudest voices in the room now, but in a way the only voices, because other ones sort of, they cancel out everything else, then we're going to stay exactly where we are, right? We're going to continue this cycle of violence. And just one more thing I want to add about it in relationship to something that Jeff was saying before. Now, what was it? Oh, yeah, this is it. So, and this was a big characteristic of what happened for me last year as I talked to students who were really struggling, feeling that October 7th had been erased, struggling, feeling like there wasn't, the voices of those supporting Palestinian lives were being silenced here. And this was all sort of stuff on campus. Is that there's no good way out of it, right? That's what's hard. As a teacher, that's hard. Right? I admire you, Mustafa, for being stay, and I think you're right, staying in the conversation is optimistic, right? But when we try and talk our way out of this, help people find their way through, we don't know where we're going. And that also makes it hard to talk about.
There's a lot of good questions coming in, and I still want to continue on this topic a little bit. So let me turn to Aaron and ask you again the same question of what specifically about this conflict is, if you think it is particularly contentious or has been particularly contentious, difficult to talk about, why this particular conflict?
So this is a conflict that is really core for a variety of communities, Jewish, Arab, and Muslim in particular. And of course, those communities overlap in some respects. And one of the challenges in talking about this conflict is that there are a variety of views in those communities that make it harder to have good conversations, constructive conversations with folks that you disagree with. On this particular topic. And I've spent, based on what I study and also my relationships, I've spent basically the last 20 years moving among these communities. Growing up in a Jewish community, going off to college, getting really interested in studying Islam, getting pretty good at Arabic pretty quickly, which meant that much of my social circle was not in the Jewish community, but in the Arab and Muslim communities at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was an undergrad. And really that's just being, having the window into how folks who come from different backgrounds to me think about these issues. One of the things I have a window into in all these contexts, though, is casual prejudices that people hold. Now, it's easy to spot folks who are bigoted in a really explicit and clear way. And those ideas are a problem. There's no doubt about it. But I think in some respects, part of what makes it so much harder to talk about an issue such as Israel-Palestine is the more casual bigotry, whether it is anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian sentiment. And I could sit up here and give examples of all these things that I've heard, because often I'll be in a room where either the person engaging in anti-Semitism doesn't know I'm Jewish, or the person engaging in Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian sentiment doesn't know that that some of my closest friends hail from these communities. And so I've heard a lot of this stuff. And just to broadly speak about the dynamics of this kind of bigotry, of this kind of casual bigotry, it's that it assumes that the other group is simple, that they're different, that they all function together, that they have a secret plan together, and you don't know exactly what it is and how it works, but it's a plan. And that therefore, those people are probably out to get you at some point or another. I have heard variations of this time and again. And every time I do it, I smile and I say, all right, Aaron, it's time for a conversation. And the interesting thing is when you have that conversation with people, they listen. They say, oh gosh, I didn't even realize I was falling into that trap. That, stereotypes are a form of shortcut. We use shortcuts in our lives to navigate socially, but that's a really bad kind of shortcut. And let me think about how I can avoid falling into that trap in the future. But when people fall into this trap, they perceive other communities as incapable of having a conversation, other communities with which they might be in tension over a given issue, and B, they often say things that deeply alienate and offend and hurt members of other communities. And so it's not to take away from the real challenges that this more explicit form of bigotry holds for intercommunal relations, but it is to say that actually there's a much softer and easier target here of asking this question of how do we think really reflectively about how we speak about other communities, about how we think of them not as internally coherent in ways that our communities are never, but rather as similarly complex. And how do we avoid the kind of mental shortcuts that lead us to saying things that really are this kind of casual bigotry?
So, I want to offer actually a few reasons that the class that I teach, which actually they should be here, the one credit class that we're doing on ethnic and religious tolerance, but in preparation for coming to this program here, we were talking about some of the reasons that Israel-Palestine is so contentious. I just want to raise a few of those before turning to the questions that come from the audience. And some of those, they point out that all three of the major Abrahamic religions originated in that part of the world. And I think that's important to note. And that means that people who are Muslim or Jewish or Christian grow up with narratives of Israel-Palestine that are very important to them and that are truly embedded, literally embedded in their faith and in the books that they read regularly, in the Bible that they study or in the Quran that they read, whatever the case may be. They're deeply embedded narratives, and it's very hard to confront those and to recognize that the region today may be very different than the region was in those times or than the way the region was portrayed in those times. That the story that the Bible, that our sacred texts are telling, isn't necessarily the story of today. So the connection with the Abrahamic texts, I think, is very key. Another reason that we came up with a simple familiarity with it, Israel happens to have a very vibrant tourist industry. There are also a lot of Israelis who travel abroad and Palestinians who are abroad and Palestinian diaspora communities. As a result, it's a part of the world that many of us have personal familiarity with. So we tend to care and have a little bit more investment in that part of the world than we may in some other parts of the world that are also very conflict-ridden. Another important reason, of course, is U.S. aid to Israel. That I often hear, why is nobody protesting the violence going on in blank, Sudan or wherever the case may be, and of course, or Russia against Ukraine. And of course, the reason is because what can you protest about the violence, about Russian aggression in Ukraine? We have already cut off, or at least until today, the United States had already cut off Russia, already had extensive sanctions on Russia, already wasn't dealing with Russia. So you can't really protest the Congress about that. Whereas Israel, there is something to protest because of the U.S. relationship with Israel. Another is, of course, just the geopolitical importance of that region. And the reason that so many religions originated there, it being at the nexus between Europe and Asia, and also the importance that it holds for the great powers, for the United States, for Russia, the role that it's played in proxy wars during the Cold War that continue to take place today. I mean, Russia has an interest in this war because it takes attention away from its own war in Ukraine. So there's a lot of reasons that it's more significant or that it has more resonance here for us than other conflicts. I'll also point out that these polemics that we have, we really talk in binaries, and some of you have mentioned that. Is Israel a settler colonial state, or is it the result of the national liberation movement of the Jews? Those seem like binaries. They seem like polar opposites, when of course the reality is that both of those have truths in them. And we need to recognize that both narratives have truths and talk in terms of that. There's other narratives that arise in relationship to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that we haven't talked all that much about. The degree to which anti-Zionism is related to anti-Semitism, and also just the significance of anti-Semitism. Is anti-Semitism a relic of the past, or is it in a resurgence right now? That's another binary that really both have elements of truth in them, and I think we need to recognize that. And on the settler colonial thing, I think also another reason that this conflict seems so significant is two of the biggest crimes of the 19th century, two of the biggest crimes of the 20th century, colonialism and the Holocaust, both have repercussions in Israel, Palestine right now. For some, it is seen as a colonial project, and for others, it is seen as a redemption project after the Holocaust. So I think for that reason, it touches on so many things that are so important to us, on so many of the values that we hold, that it becomes a major topic. And then I'll turn to a bunch of the questions that were asked, and there really is a whole bunch of them dealing with different aspects, but one that came up several times has to do with the relationship between Zionism and Judaism, and perhaps anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So I'll pose that to whoever wants to try to address that, if any of you want to try to address that in any way.
The challenge of that question, right, is that most people would affirm that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I would affirm that. The problem is often how anti-Zionism is expressed is it draws continually and often on classic anti-Semitic tropes. So how do you actually separate that? So that's what I'll say about that. The other thing that I've noticed, on campus, as we've tried, and another thing that many of us have been involved with, in the context of the Wallenberg Institute and other efforts, is to address these challenging things on our campus and try to offer from our expertise, such as it is, ways to address this. So, we have done some things trying to sort of reach out to attune people to the challenges of understanding anti-Semitism, to the serious threat that it poses, and how inauspicious it is for all of us, every group, when anti-Semitism is very present. And I've definitely had the feeling that when there's a point in that conversation where we might say, and very often anti-Zionism draws upon the tropes of anti-Semitism. They're like, oh, that's what it is. That anti-Semitism is only about, or calling on only about shutting down sort of a discourse about supporting Palestine, right? That it becomes only that. And so we get lost in sort of the ways, the perniciousness of anti-Semitism as the canary in the coal mine, as it has been, and how it threatens our whole society.
About Zionism and Judaism, so in going back to Europe, so the idea, think about I think about, based on scholarship, on scholarly works, that Zionism emerged in one way as a response to anti-Semitism. And it's actually very interesting to look at its origins in 19th century Europe and the ways that non-Jews, or the majority of Christian Europeans, or many Christian Europeans, stigmatized Jews in Europe as Semites. And some of these Semites, for example, I can think of a number of people, but some of these Jews embraced that stigma of being Semites. And the idea that we hear today from some people who direct their calls to some immigrants, like, go back to your home country. So back in the 19th century, some Jews embraced that stigma as being Semites, and they said, okay, if you think that we go back to the land of the Bible, so we actually should go back to the land of the Bible because you define us or see us as Semites. And those are Zionists. Interestingly, at the same time, 19th century, also Arabs and Muslims, let's say Arabs, who live outside of Europe also identify themselves as Semites. And they bore arms. They actually stood together with persecuted Jews in Europe to fight against European bigotry and colonialism, what they perceived as internal colonialism against Jews in Europe. And they wrote articles and condemned the Dreyfus Affair. And they wrote about the contradictions of European liberalism and democratic values, whereas they persecuted their own Jewish people, like Jews in Europe, European Jews. So there is one part of it is that Zionists decided to embrace the stigma of being Semites and go back to the land of the Bible, that was the land of Palestine, Israel. And interestingly, once they are in the land of the Bible, that is Israel, Palestine, they thought that from Herzl's point of view, the Herzlian vision of a political Zionism is that to be accepted in Europe, the only way to do so is to embrace European values and to be front towards the savage Asia, for example. That he wrote about this in his diaries. So it's not like a hidden thing. So the majority of Zionist leaders at the time were seculars, but the Bible were secular, but the Bible for them was very significant to implement this vision to go back to the land of our ancestors. I wrote about this in my book. If you are interested, I read about it. I write about it like a great deal and look at the ways in which Zionists casted away the exilic identity and picked on a new identity to be in harmony with the landscape, with human and nature landscape. But the Bible is very central to Zionism, albeit it's a secular movement. The leaders of the Zionist movement were themselves not observant. Herzl, when he visited Jerusalem in late 19th century, he did not observe Sabbath. Nevertheless, people perceived him as a prophet because he entered Jerusalem on the back of a white donkey, based on, I think, a picture in Isaiah, I believe. So they perceived him as a Messiah, and also some Oriental Jews at the time thought that Herzl was a prophet. And Arabs thought or viewed Herzl as the prophet of the Jews.
So I'll just make a quick comment about how to understand Zionism and how I think about it from my particular perspective as someone who began my career in Islamic studies before moving into working on Israel, Palestine. The first is that one of the arguments, a lot of the argument regarding Zionism is about origins and continuity. Where does it come from, right? But we've talked about Zionism as a form of Jewish nationalism, like other nationalisms that emerge across the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I don't find those ruptures to be particularly surprising. I would be surprised if there weren't ruptures. The second is a comment I'll make about critiques of Zionism that pivot on its practical manifestations. And this is not a comment about whether Zionism is a philosophy that one should agree with or not, but rather to draw a parallel, namely to debates about Islamism and its practical manifestations. Now, there are basically two parallel debates. One which argues that Islamism is a good thing, which focuses on theory, and those who argue against Islamism say, oh no, but look at it in practice. There are those who argue for Zionism and say, look, it's a good thing, look at the theory. And then there are others who argue against it and say, look at it in practice. Now, the point I'll make here very simply is whatever question we ask, we have to ask the same question about both. And I think it's reasonable to be critical of how projects are instantiated in practice, but also to think about the ways in which broadly political projects often fall short.
Thanks. We are getting close to running out of time and wrapping up. And I've still got a lot of questions that have been asked. So let me pose probably a final round. Drawing from a lot of the questions that were asked had to do with things that have gone on campus here over the last year, with the protests, disruptive protests. When is disruption permissible? A lot has had to do with silencing voices, particularly silencing voices on the grounds of anti-Semitism, where people are concerned that certain voices are being silenced for that reason. A lot of questions have to do with the new federal administration that people are critical of, to say the least, over policies that they fear could be stifling speech and things that people think the university has done to stifle speech. So I want to pose those questions and then also pose to you a final question, which is advice that you would have for the future that maybe addresses those, that maybe addresses how to have free speech in the future in the climate that we're moving into. So maybe I start with you, Carla.
So
there's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there. So I'll just say this one thing that came from something that a student shared in my class just before this, which was if you look, because we're looking back historically at Jewish experience at the University of Michigan, if you were going to look back at this moment 100 years from now, what would you see? And a person made the point that it might look like that the Jewish students were really favored, right? That the university bent all over backwards to support them and to protect them and make sure that, and to silence the Palestinians. But that from a lot of Jewish students' perspectives of the past year, they were terribly silenced and the university was not responsive to the things that they wanted to do. So, I mean, just what you said is it's such a, that we're living through this time is so impossible. And dealing with these issues and trying to be heard and not being able to agree about even the terms we're talking about. So I'll just take from it, and the challenges are going to keep on coming. Like, it is on us to sort of stand up to them and listen to our other stories and tell our own.
I'll just actually add to what you've said, that having, in my own role as director of this new institute, as I was speaking to people around campus, over the last year, it has been striking to me how many people from different perspectives feel that they have been silenced.
Right, exactly.
That both sides really feel that they're not permitted to speak their minds. Both sides feel that the university is biased in one way or the other. Both feel that the cards are stacked against them. And I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign, right? It's better than just one side, but obviously people want to feel that they can speak, but it's definitely posing challenges to the university community, and that's part of what we at the Wallenberg Institute, we on this panel, are trying to deal with.
Did you want us also to give our little piece of advice?
Yeah, I'll give you a little piece of advice, yeah.
So I was thinking about this. One of the best things that we did this year in this Jewish Communal Leadership Program in the School of Social Work is we built for the holiday of Sukkot a sukkah we do every year in the courtyard of the School of Social Work, which is part of observing that holiday, a temporary structure. And we invited other student groups within the school to come and talk to us and talk about the holiday and about resilience and different things that we were associated with it. And one of these conversations, I'm not even going to say who it was because even talking to people now is contested. But so we did this step. We invited people in. And we ended up having this I know I approached it with fear. I know some of my students approached it with fear. I imagine those coming to us because we carried all those assumptions about others and what do we do, all the prejudices that we have. And this is existential stuff and we're all challenged. And it was the most amazing moment of my year, right? Because we had the conversation, we were able to talk across differences. It showed me a sense of possibility. I was wondering why that was, and as I was thinking about it this week, I realized that they came in to talk to us with appreciation, with curiosity, with openness. I'm sure they also were feeling like, I'm ready to get our defenses up. But they led with curiosity and generosity. And that's my wisdom, to not be afraid of having these conversations, but then also to have our ears open.
And I'll say, before I turn to Aaron, but I'll say, I just want to agree with you on that, is that it also is amazing that you can have these conversations in the right format. And during the period of the encampment last year and during the protests last year, I always felt on the diag, it was impossible to have conversations. It was just people shouting at each other, shouting slogans at each other, holding signs against each other. But in the classroom, you really could have those deep conversations in a controlled environment where people are assuming the best of each other, where they get to know each other. They know that, class meets Tuesday, Thursday. On Tuesday, they know that they're going to be in class with the people again on Thursday instead of just passing them in the diag. You really could have these constructive conversations. And most people don't see that. They see what's happening, in the diag or on the campuses that shows up on the news, but they don't see what's going on in the classroom. And my colleagues at other universities would say the same thing. My colleagues at Columbia, at Penn, institutions that have been in the news, at Berkeley, have made the same comment, that within the classroom, you can do a lot and speak across differences. Aaron?
Yeah, Jeff, so I'd second what you're saying about the classroom, but I'd actually broaden it to say, in private spaces for students, there are extraordinary conversations that can be had. I think there have been real restrictions on public debate, but that doesn't restrict the conversations you can have with your peers, right? And I think actually that those are some of the most valuable conversations there are. Now, in terms of advice, I guess, from a grizzled, 20-year veteran of navigating these challenges, I would say that one of the best grounding mechanisms that I've found when talking about Israel-Palestine is to ask the question of, well, what do the people in the territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan want? Do they want a one-state solution? Do they want a two-state solution? If so, what would it look like? Because this isn't about us, right? It's about them. And that doesn't mean we're not allowed to have opinions and to care deeply. But ultimately, if we ground that conversation in what people living in the Holy Land are seeking, with a basic principle of the importance of core individual rights for all the people who live in this territory, then I think we can actually have some really productive conversations.
Mustafa, I'll give you the...
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier that because I used to teach the course on Israel-Palestine, and when the students come to the class and I ask them the question, why are you interested in this subject? And the typical answer is, I'm interested in 3 credits. I'm actually here because I want to graduate from, I want to get my degree, etc. But during the fall of 23, there was something actually extraordinary happened that I experienced in the classroom. I found a student coming to the classroom actually very ready for discussions, very ready, like they did the homework, they read the materials, and they come ready for questions, a lot of questions. And that made my actually life a lot easier. It is easier for me to find an engaged student than a student who are not interested in the subject and doing something else behind the screen that I cannot see. I do see, but I pretend not to see, not to pick up a fight every now and then with a student who is doing something else behind the screen. But why did this happen? Because I had these students who would come to the class with wearing the kufiya, Palestinian kufiya, and those carrying the Israeli flag with them. They have a constructive conversation in the classroom, and they go shout at one another on the diag. But what was interesting that I actually noticed is that they own their narrative. Now, they are owning the narrative. They're advocating for it. they feel that they can do something about what is happening, or they want to do something about what is happening. People were watching them actually from all over the world. One of the interesting things, or the advantages of knowing some languages, is that to see the reflection of a student encampment outside, especially in the Arab world, for example, like people would have high hopes, used to have high hopes of the United States to find a solution, a just and peaceful solution between Palestinians and Israelis. And they thought from this group of people, from this generation, a change will happen. So they had high hopes. Their hopes were pinned on these students who were voicing their concerns about the United States and its favoring of the Israeli side over the Palestinian side that seemed very obvious to them, and they wanted to do something about it. So I felt that vigorousness and that students from both sides actually want to own their narrative. They want to practice their agency and having both constructive conversation in the classroom and take part in student activism outside of the classroom. And also, like the protests brought up so many things that I myself have never thought about. Like there are certain slogans, for example, some people found them offensive and they want to learn more about that. It was a good moment for me and for some students to have a constructive conversation about certain things. So it was something that was from maybe scholarly point of view as an educator, it was helpful. About the advice that I would like to render at the end of the conversation is that it draws from what Jeff mentioned earlier about the Bible and the Quran, about this shared scripture, shared legacy between both sides. And I teach a course on the Bible and the Quran in the fall, and it attracts a mix of students from different backgrounds. One of the biblical verses that we spend some time discuss and understand is that in Genesis 1:27, it says that God created man in His image. In His image, He created him. This biblical verse resonates with a prophetic tradition, prophetic hadith that says that it's a hadith attributed to Prophet Muhammad, in which he says that God created Adam in his form, in his image. Well, how do we understand this? And that sparks a conversation, goes back to the Middle Ages and continues to the present. Do we mean like here any physical resemblance between a human being and God, or do we mean something else? Except for Christianity, both Judaism and Islam, and also some Christian thinkers believe that it's actually not about physical resemblance. It's about the moral qualities, about the intellect, about mercy, about moral values. Those are things that are embedded in human beings. And we should not, I think my advice to myself first and to everybody else is that we have, rather than reducing people to categories or to labels, whether you are a Jew or you are a Muslim, Palestinian, an Arab, etc., that is not helpful at all. It's not healthy, because we are reducing something that is very beautiful, very complicated, very complex into just monodimensional thing, and that is in of itself self-demeaning. Like I don't have the intellectual ability to think about other humans in a complicated, complex way. So Israel-Palestine is one of the issues through which we can educate ourselves better to learn the multidimensional way people think about Israel-Palestine without resorting to only monodimensional way of looking at human beings and classifying them, categorizing them, reducing them to labels.
Before we wrap up and before we thank the panelists, I just wanted to let people know about upcoming events that we have. Perfectly timed there. On March 11th, we'll be doing another one of these conversations here on what are the driving forces behind hatred, featuring Eric Ward, Wajahat Ali, and Amy Spitalnik, all of whom will be coming in from outside to talk to us.
Not here.
It won't be in this very place. No, it'll be in the Kinesiology building. And then on March 18th, what is genocide and should we name it? Which will feature Yuri Kaparulin, who is actually here in the audience, and Stephen Ratner, who's also here in the audience, and Linda Kinsler, who will be coming in from outside the university. So I hope that you're all able to join us for those. And on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for coming.